My name is Margaret Hale, and at 64, I never imagined I would be hiding in my neighbor's living room, watching my own house as if it belonged to a stranger. Yet that night, there I was, sitting behind Mr. Klein's lace curtain with a cooling cup of chamomile tea between my palms. The street outside was quiet the way only small Ohio towns get after 10, but my heart thudded like I'd stepped into a crime scene instead of the life I'd built for 40 years. Across the road, my porch light flicked on. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that house. My son and daughter-in-law thought I was on a week-long bus tour through Tennessee, posting pictures of mountains I wasn't actually visiting. The truth was far less peaceful. I had slipped out with a single suitcase, crossed the street, and knocked on Mr. Klein's door with a trembling hand. He hadn't asked many questions, just stepped aside and whispered, "If you really want answers, Margaret, wait until midnight. That's when they stop pretending." Those words kept echoing in my mind as I leaned closer to the window. A sedan rolled up to my curb and stopped right under my maple tree. The engine cut. A man I had never seen before climbed out, dragging a wheeled suitcase, the kind travelers take to cheap motels. He walked straight toward my front door with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. My breath hitched. My fingers tightened around the teacup. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face, tired, confused, and burning with a kind of fear I hadn't felt since the night I lost my husband. I didn't know what I would find by staying here, but I knew I couldn't look away now. When the man with the suitcase disappeared into my house and the porch light blinked off behind him, something inside me tightened like a knot pulled too fast. I kept my eyes on the front door a moment longer, letting the shadows settle across the siding. Then I leaned back in Mr. Klein's chair, and my mind drifted to the weeks before everything tipped into this nightmare. Back then, nothing seemed dangerous. Strange, maybe. Unsettling at times, but not dangerous. It started the afternoon Daniel and Vanessa told me they wanted to move in for a while. They stood in my kitchen with hopeful smiles, explaining how their own apartment lease had ended and how it would help everyone if we shared expenses. Vanessa made tea and placed the mug carefully in front of me, the way someone does when they're trying to earn trust. Daniel kept touching my shoulder, telling me it would be temporary, just a few months until they got things sorted out. I remember thinking it was sweet of them. I'd been alone since Thomas passed, and the thought of hearing another voice in the house besides my own felt like a comfort I hadn't realized I missed. The first few days went smoothly. Vanessa reorganized my pantry, humming softly under her breath. Daniel spent time in the basement, setting up what he called a small workspace. Though the hum of his nervous energy told me he wasn't doing much working, I chalked it up to pride. Men in their 30s carry quiet burdens they don't always want to confess, but small things began shifting in ways I couldn't explain. One evening, I came downstairs to grab a glass of water and found a damp towel crumpled near the laundry hamper. I hadn't showered that night, and both Daniel and Vanessa insisted they hadn't either. The smell wasn't familiar, cheap hotel soap, harsh and citrusy. I let it go, though it stayed in the back of my mind like a pebble in a shoe. A few days later, I heard footsteps walking softly past my bedroom door close to 2 a.m. When I stepped into the hallway, everything was silent again. I figured Daniel had trouble sleeping. But the next morning, I noticed the guest bathroom trash can was full of travel-size shampoo packets and paper bands from disposable cups. I asked Vanessa about it as she cooked breakfast. Her spatula froze mid-air before she laughed lightly and said she had cleaned out an old overnight bag. The explanation slid off her tongue too easily, too cheerfully, as if rehearsed. I wanted to believe her, but something in the pit of my stomach didn't settle. Then came the night I opened the door expecting Daniel and instead found a young couple on my porch. They stood under the porch light, each holding a matching roller bag. The woman smiled politely and asked if this was the place from the listing. I felt a flush of heat climb up my neck. Before I could respond, Vanessa rushed in from behind me, squeezing between us with a too-wide grin. She apologized to the couple, insisting there must have been a mistake, and ushered them off the porch so quickly that the man nearly tripped over the step. When she closed the door, she scolded me for opening it so suddenly, as if I'd embarrassed her. The whole interaction gnawed at me. There had been recognition in the couple's eyes, the kind you see when someone is absolutely certain they're in the right place. And for the briefest moment, Vanessa's mask had slipped. Her voice shook. Her hands trembled. A few days after that, Mr. Klein stopped me as I walked to the mailbox. He spoke gently, the way he always did, but there was something grave underneath his tone. He said he'd seen a few unfamiliar folks visiting late at night, carrying the same kind of small suitcases people take on weekend trips. His lips pressed into a thin line when he added that this had happened more than once. More than twice, actually. I remember standing there with the sun warm against my sweater, realizing I could no longer pretend everything was harmless. The uneasiness that had been quietly circling me finally settled on my shoulders. That night, long before I sat behind Mr. Klein's curtain watching a stranger walk into my house, the truth began to whisper at the edges of my mind. Something was wrong. And whatever it was getting closer. The night after seeing the couple on my porch, I lay awake listening to the old house creak the way it always had, but the familiar sounds felt different, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel and Vanessa were asleep downstairs, or at least I hoped they were. I stared at the ceiling and felt a throb of something that wasn't quite fear yet, more like the slow realization that the people you love might be hiding things you were never supposed to notice. The next morning, I tried to watch them with fresh eyes. Daniel avoided my gaze at breakfast, fiddling with his phone, tapping his foot under the table. Vanessa was chipper in that brittle way that made everything feel staged. The tension between them was so thick it made the air feel heavier. And for the first time, I wondered whether they were hiding something from each other as well. By afternoon, I'd made up my mind. If something strange was happening in my house, I needed to see it clearly, not through assumptions, not through whispers, but with my own two eyes. I couldn't do that living under the same roof with them. So I told them I was taking a trip. I crafted the story carefully, letting my voice shake just enough to make it sound spontaneous. A friend from my old church group had invited me on a bus tour through Tennessee. I said, I thought a change of scenery might do me good. Vanessa clapped her hands together, too eagerly, telling me it was a wonderful idea. Daniel hugged me, but his arms felt tight, rushed, as if he wanted to push me out the door more than he wanted me to enjoy a vacation. I packed a small suitcase with clothes I didn't intend to wear, then added the items I actually needed, my late husband's small binoculars, a notebook with a soft leather cover, and a flashlight. Before leaving, I stood in the middle of my living room and looked around. I tried to memorize the way the warm afternoon light settled on the wooden floors Thomas had restored himself, the faint scent of lavender from the spray Vanessa used, the placement of every small object. I didn't know why I felt the need to do that, maybe because I sensed something in my home was shifting without me. When I locked my front door and rolled my suitcase to the curb, I felt Daniel and Vanessa watching me from the window. I waved with what I hoped looked like excitement, then walked down the street. But instead of heading toward the bus depot, I crossed directly to Mr. Klein's house. He opened the door before I could even knock twice. His face softened when he saw my suitcase, and he motioned me inside without a word. The kindness in that simple gesture nearly undid me. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together. We kept the lights low as he set me up in the small guest room facing the street. From there, my own house sat squarely across from us, framed like a picture I no longer recognized. It felt surreal, watching it from the outside, knowing I was supposed to be hundreds of miles away. The first night passed with a quiet that didn't feel peaceful. Around 10, the porch light flicked on. A woman walked up the steps, dragging a carry-on bag. Vanessa greeted her with a practiced smile and guided her inside. Mr. Klein and I exchanged a look. Neither of us spoke. The second night, 2 young men arrived around midnight. They handed Vanessa an envelope, thick enough that I could see the bulge even from across the street. She tucked it into her sweater and ushered them into the living room. My stomach turned. I'd suspected short-term rentals, but seeing it happen so openly made the betrayal feel heavier. On the third night, something changed. Around 11, a dark SUV pulled up. A man stepped out wearing a crisp jacket and carrying a leather briefcase. He didn't knock. Vanessa opened the door as if she'd been waiting for him. They talked in the entryway, and though I couldn't hear their words, I saw her gesture toward the kitchen. He nodded once, sharply. Mr. Klein leaned toward me, his voice low. "That one isn't here for a room." I didn't answer. A chill crawled up my arms. Something deeper than illegal rentals was happening in my home, and the realization settled in my bones with a cold weight I couldn't shake. That was the moment I stopped fearing I was overreacting and started fearing I might be too late. On the 4th morning of my so-called vacation, I woke earlier than usual. Mr. McCline was already in the kitchen, making coffee the way older men do, slowly, precisely, as if it were a small ritual keeping the world in order. I joined him quietly, the 2 of us standing side by side while the pot filled the room with a warm, grounding aroma. For a brief moment, it steadied my nerves, then the worry crept back in. Today had to be the day. I couldn't keep watching from across the street, letting my imagination twist itself into knots. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes, even if it broke me. By late morning, Daniel and Vanessa drove off in their gray sedan. Vanessa was dressed neatly, carrying a tote bag. Daniel looked pale, defeated, rubbing his forehead as if fighting a headache. Their car disappeared around the corner, and I felt something in my chest lock into place. This was my chance. I slipped out of Mr. Klein's back door and crossed the narrow alley that led to my yard. The sun was bright, almost too bright, washing everything in a cheerfulness that didn't match what I felt. When I reached the side entrance, my hands were trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to fit the key into the lock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was silent in a way that made my skin prickle. I could still smell the faint traces of last night, cheap perfume, takeout food, someone's cologne lingering near the stairs, moving slowly. I headed toward the basement door. They usually kept it locked, but Daniel had forgotten to secure it Wednesday night. I turned the knob gently, holding my breath. It opened. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way down, the air growing cooler and darker. The basement had always been cluttered but harmless, a place for old paint cans, holiday decorations, and Thomas's tools. Now it felt foreign, rearranged quietly in my absence. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of storage bins, something metallic caught the dim light. I walked toward it and saw a small locked box, the kind people use for petty cash. My heart hammered. I lifted it. It was heavier than I expected. When I shook it gently, soft thuds sounded inside, thick, solid, unmistakably paper. My palms grew damp. Nearby, on a table that had once held Thomas's fishing tackle, lay a manila folder. I hesitated only a second before opening it. Inside were documents printed with my name, my full legal name, Margaret Hale, typed neatly across the top, power of attorney forms, medical capacity evaluation requests, intake papers for Maple Grove Care Center. Notes in Vanessa's handwriting circled in red ink. Under one page, I found a loose sheet of lined paper with a hurried scrawl. Caswell said mild sedatives won't show. Give her a dose before the evaluation. Need her to appear confused. Once POA is granted, we move forward. The words blurred for a moment as tears welled up, though not the dramatic kind, just a dull, stinging pressure that gathered behind my eyes. I pressed my hand to my mouth to steady myself. The betrayal felt physical, like something sharp lodged beneath my ribs. They hadn't just planned to rent out my home, they had planned to take me out of it. I forced myself to breathe, to swallow, to move. I pulled out my phone and photographed every document, every scrap of handwriting. The flash stayed off. I didn't dare risk the light. I opened the lockbox using a small screwdriver from Thomas's toolkit, my hands shaking so much the tool nearly slipped. Inside, stacks of 20s, 50s, and hundreds were rubber banded together, thousands of dollars. The smell of worn paper and basement dust filled my nose. Footsteps sounded faintly outside, someone walking past on the sidewalk above. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears. When the sound faded, I put everything back exactly the way I found it, down to the angle of the folder on the table. I couldn't risk tipping them off. As I climbed the stairs, every step felt like it might give me away. I slipped out the side door, closed it carefully behind me, and hurried through the alley with my heart pounding. When I reached Mr. E. Klein's porch, I nearly collapsed onto the bench. He didn't ask any questions. He just sat next to me, hands folded patiently in his lap. He knew. That afternoon, we called his daughter, Rachel, an attorney who handled elder law. When she arrived, her expression shifted from polite concern to quiet alarm as she scrolled through the photos on my phone. She didn't mince words. What Daniel and Vanessa were setting up could have stripped me of every decision I still had the right to make. Rachel promised she would take care of the paperwork, revoking old permissions, updating my will, filing an anonymous complaint with the city. I nodded through it all, barely hearing her voice. My mind kept returning to the basement, the documents, the cold shape of that lockbox in my hands. By evening, the first protective filings were complete, but paperwork wasn't the part I dreaded. The hardest part would come soon, when I walked back into my own home and pretended I didn't know a single thing, and I had to be convincing. When I stepped back into my house after those days across the street, the air greeted me like something that had shifted in my absence. I closed the door gently and let the familiar scent settle around me, though even that seemed slightly off, tinged by traces of cologne I didn't recognize. Vanessa hurried in from the kitchen, her smile bright and fragile, wrapping her arms around me as if her embrace could mask the tension shaking through her shoulders. Daniel followed more slowly, trying to look composed, but the worry etched into his face betrayed him. I told them about the trip I never took, describing sights I hadn't seen and meals I hadn't eaten. They nodded eagerly, acting relieved, though neither could hold eye contact for long. I moved through the rooms purposely, noting how objects were shifted by inches, how the guest towels looked freshly used, how the air held whispers of people I had never invited. I knew I had to pretend ignorance convincingly until everything was in motion. Over the next 2 days, I watched them from behind a calm expression. Daniel barely slept, pacing the living room after midnight. Vanessa clung to her phone nervously, stepping into the hallway whenever she received a message. Their attempts to behave normally only emphasize the secret straining between them. I let them continue believing they controlled the narrative, though my hands tightened every time I remembered what I'd found in the basement. By Friday evening, the pressure inside the house felt like a storm about to break. Vanessa insisted on making dinner, her movements frantic as she chopped vegetables and stirred pots as if noise could drown out fear. Daniel sat at the counter, staring at his hands. I joined them quietly, waiting. At 7. The first knock came. A young couple stood at the door with backpacks, smiling politely before Vanessa ushered them down the hallway. My stomach turned, but I remained seated. More guests arrived soon after, 2 women with a duffel bag, a man dragging a suitcase. They moved confidently through my home as though they had paid for the right to occupy it. Each unfamiliar footstep echoed through the hallway like a warning. I sat on the sofa pretending to watch television, but my mind was fixed on the front door. When the knock came at 8:30, Daniel answered it with trembling hands. A man in a navy windbreaker stood there, badge clipped to his chest, a clipboard in hand. "City Code Enforcement," he said. "We received a complaint about possible unlicensed rentals at this address." Vanessa froze, searching for an explanation, but her voice cracked before she could form one. The inspector stepped inside, taking in the scene with calm authority. He walked through the living room, down the hallway, into the guest rooms, noting the air mattresses, the stacks of linens, the envelopes of cash. I followed a few steps behind him, my heartbeat steadying with every detail he recorded. When he returned, he asked who owned the house. "I do," I said. "My name is Margaret Hale, and I didn't authorize any of this." The room went still. Vanessa's face crumpled. Daniel inhaled sharply, as if bracing for a blow. The inspector informed them of the violations and instructed all guests to leave. Strangers began filing out, offering apologetic glances. When the door closed behind the last one, the silence weighed heavier than their footsteps. I turned to the 2 people I once trusted most. "Now," I said, "tell me the truth." Vanessa began to cry, her words spilling out in fragments: debts, overdue bills, desperation, a plan that had grown beyond her control. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to look at me. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos from the basement, the evaluation request, the nursing home paperwork, the note about sedatives. Vanessa covered her mouth, horrified. Daniel looked like he might collapse. "You were preparing to remove me from my own home," I said quietly, "and you were willing to make me appear confused to do it." Daniel whispered an apology, but it carried no weight. His fear, his guilt, all of it came too late. "You both need to leave," I said. "Tomorrow. No discussion." Neither argued. The next morning, they packed their belongings in strained silence. Daniel placed the spare key on the table and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom." Before walking out, Vanessa avoided my eyes as she stepped through the door. In the days that followed, the house felt wounded but breathing again. Rachel helped finalize the legal protections. I opened windows to let in fresh air, reclaiming each room slowly. When I returned to the basement, sunlight streamed through the glass blocks. I cleared the table where the lockbox once rested and set up an easel, brushes, canvas, light filling the space that had held their secrets. The healing wasn't sudden, but it began. And if my story reaches you, stay for the next one, subscribe, and let the stories find you when you need them most.